everybody, and welcome. My name is Catherine Schulten.
And I'm Michael Goncher.
And we are editors at the New York Times Learning Network, and also both of us are former high school humanities teachers here in New York City. This is the fourth of 4 webinars we did this fall, but don't worry if you enjoyed them. We are going to have a whole new slate of webinars coming this spring, and if you have ideas for those, please let us know. Most of what we're going to be talking about you can find on our site, which is called the Learning Network. If you have never seen it before, this is what it looks like literally today, because this is a screenshot from this morning, but we've been around since 1998, so you might have known it in other iterations. It is our job to go through the Times every day and find content across sections that we know that teachers can use, and we then turn that into lesson plans or quizzes or contests or daily writing prompts or whatever. We're only presenting a very small part of our site today, so we hope you'll just go in and click around and see what you find. Okay, we are going to move very quickly along here, and I want you to meet 2 people who are joining us for this webinar. We always have a teacher join us, and today it's Brett Vogelsinger, and he is actually physically in the room with us from Bucks County, Pennsylvania today.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here.
And he's going to join Michael and me later when we talk to you about all the resources we have to help you teach with the Times. But we're going to start with Evan Sandhouse. Evan is actually dialing in from Spain right now, where he is in a hotel room at a conference. So he's very kind to be here. He is the head of digital archive platforms and metadata for the New York Times. And I have no more idea of what that means than you probably do, but I think Evan knows what it means and he will explain it. I asked him to do this, though, because he is also the brains behind what I consider to be the very best resource for history teachers that the Times has, and that is Times Machine. So, Evan, take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, Catherine. It's really a pleasure to be addressing such a large audience. And the good news is, even though it's 10 o'clock in Spain right now, people don't show up to our restaurant till about another hour from now in Barcelona. So we're good. As Catherine said, I work at the New York Times as our head of sort of digital archives, and I oversee a couple of teams in my work that have to do with structuring our archive and making the content accessible to users. So some of that is digital housekeeping, and some of that is overseeing a team that applies taxonomy tags to our archive. But I love my job because I love our archives. And as Catherine mentioned, one of the things that I'm most proud of that I've had the privilege of working on in my career at the Times is this product, Times Machine. And Times Machine is essentially a tool that lets you view complete digital replicas of New York Times issues in your browser as they originally appeared in print. For those of you who have been around long enough to know what microfilm is, it's quite a lot like a virtual microfilm machine. You can see every single page laid out side by side, and click and zoom and read to your heart's content over the entire archive of the New York Times. And that entire archive, for all you math fans out there, is about 55,000. Well, I should start and say the New York Times first issue was published on September 18th, 1851. And Times Machine covers up everything through December 31st, 2002. That ends up being roughly, I think, 55,000 issues that span about 3.5 million pages that have in the neighborhood of about 13 million articles. So 13 million articles, everything we published between 1851 and 2002, available as full digital replicas. And why does it matter that we present information this way? Well, in order to explain why I think it matters, I want to tell you the story of a character named John Fairfax. Now, I don't know if you've heard of John Fairfax or not, but he came to my attention in 2012 when I stumbled across his obituary. Now, the reason John Fairfax has an obituary in the New York Times was because he was the first person to row across the Atlantic by himself. And that is an incredible achievement, but it was really other things in his obituary that got my attention and why I became curious about him as a historical figure. Here's some excerpts from his obituary. At 9, he'd settled a dispute with a pistol. At 13, he lit out for the Amazon jungle. At 20, he attempted suicide by jaguar. And then it goes on to say, one of my favorite sentences I've ever seen published in the Times. Mr. Fairfax was among the last avatars of a centuries-old figure, the lone wolf explorer, whose exploits are conceived to satisfy few but himself. So, as you can imagine, after reading that obit, I was like, oh, I got to learn more about this John Fairfax character. So, in the obit, I believe it mentions that the day he crossed the Atlantic, the day that he arrived in the U.S. from his crossing of the Atlantic, was July 19th, 1969. So I was like, all right, well, this is a big deal. The first human being in recorded history to row across the Atlantic Ocean. That should be front page news. And so I opened it up in Times Machine, and I'm pleased to report that it was front page news. There's the article right there, lower left-hand corner of the front page. But it is not reported as prominently as you might expect. And the reason for that is there were a couple of other stories on the front page that day that were also big deals. Above that story, on that same front page, you see this article about a tragic car accident involving Senator Ted Kennedy and his female passenger that history came to know as Chappaquiddick. And this, of course, was the incident that likely disqualified Ted Kennedy from ever holding national office higher than senator. It's probably the reason we never had a presidential candidate. We never had a president, Ted Kennedy. So that was another big thing that happened on the front page of July 20th, 1969 issue of the New York Times. But it wasn't the biggest story of the day, because next to that story was another. And it was about the fact that there were astronauts presently orbiting the moon, and people are about to walk on it for the very first time. In fact, that day, July 20th, 1969, was the day that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon for the first time. So, why do I go through this convoluted example to tell you that Myanmar walked on the moon on July 20th, 1969? The reason is that I feel one of the sort of most fun things about learning about history through newspapers is that events don't happen in a vacuum. The world happens all at once, every day. And there's a degree of simultaneity to events that offer us really useful context that we don't get if all we do is read articles in isolation. So, yes, it's really incredible that John Fairfax rode across the Atlantic, a feat of navigation, but not nearly the feat of navigation that walking on the moon turned out to be. And knowing that that event was employed in the context of this other event really does, I think, offer us a degree of perspective on what it was like that day in the world. And the articles are great for that. But when you have a whole newspaper, you have something in addition to articles. You have advertisements. And what I like to say about the advertisements is the articles tell you what happened in the world, but the advertisements tell you how people were living. And in this same issue, the same July 20th, 1969 issue, on page 110, there was quite a great advertisement. It is, you can see this on the left-hand side of the screen. It's for a 3-day-long music festival that was going to take place about 3 weeks after this issue was published in a town called Wallkill. It ended up getting moved because Wallkill wasn't able to host it. But the music festival was called the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. And as you can tell, there were a pretty impressive lineup of musicians scheduled to perform at that event. And if this ad grabbed your attention, you could clip out the coupon at the bottom of the ad and mail in for as many tickets as you would like. The most expensive ticket, the 3-day ticket, cost $18. But, it looks like a good show. It could probably be fun. I don't see any reason that you wouldn't want to go. And of course, the next day in the New York Times, because history happens on a 24-hour delay when you're looking at a newspaper archive, we ran the issue, the big issue, the one that you've all seen before, the Men Walk on the Moon issue. But the day that they were actually walking on the moon, that was what was in the New York Times. And I think this just adds so much more. It adds so much valuable context. I mean, to tell a room full of people like, on the day men walked on the moon, somebody arrived from rowing across the Atlantic. Ted Kennedy had gotten into a car wreck the day before. Woodstock was going to be in 3 weeks. This event was placed in a cultural moment. Similarly, you could see that with the Titanic, in that there were so many other events that were reported on that day. But discovering all the gems in our archive is a tall order. We give you 55,000 issues, 13 million articles, and a search function. And with that, you can find a lot of great stuff. But we wanted to help you out a little bit because it's such a rich resource that we thought it could benefit from a little bit of curation. So a few years ago, we started this Twitter feed. It's called NYC Archives. I suggest that you all follow it. And as some of you have noted in the chat, while Times Machine is a paid feature for subscribers, anything that we Twitter out from this account is open to the public for 7 days. We remove the paywall from Times Machine, and it's accessible for 7 days after it was tweeted. So if you're concerned that you might not have access to this as a tool, you do have access to the articles that are in this feed. And in putting together this feed, we tried to focus on 3 sort of general categories of thing in our archive. First of all, anniversaries of significant events. You look at today in history, and there's always something, and we love to remind people of it. But we also look for things in the archive that resonate with modern events. Like this 1976 profile of a young New York City businessman who was tall, blonde, and had dazzling white teeth, and the name of Donald Trump. There are many other, things that resonate with current events that we see in the newspaper as well. And when we find those things, we often put them up on the feed so that people can, appreciate that, somebody smarter than me once said, history doesn't repeat itself, sometimes it rhymes. And we try to pick up on those rhymes and put them out on the Twitter feed. And then the last category of thing on the Twitter feed, probably my personal favorite, because I'm a little irreverent, is we also find just crazy stuff in the archive. The archive of a 165-year-old newspaper is going to have some crazy stuff in it. These are a couple of examples. A fashion cat show from 1948, and a report of a ghost that was haunting Brooklyn looking for its missing hand. And the archive, one of the things that we've done on this Twitter feed, just a little aside from me, is every Saturday we've been tweeting out something about cats for the last 3 or 4 years. And that is in the tradition of Catter Day, for those of you who are familiar with that hashtag. And we've tweeted out so much about cats that we actually were able to work with a division in the Times that produces books based on the Times to release about cats of the Times. And while I have, many proud moments in my 11 plus years that I've spent with the New York Times, the fact that my name appears as an acknowledgement at the back of the book that we did on cats is one of the proudest. So that is Times Machine. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and while it is a subscriber tool, and I do encourage anybody and everybody to be subscribers to the New York Times, it is available through the Twitter feed. All of the articles that we tweeted out are available for the last 7 days. So that's Times Machine. And I'm going to throw back now to Catherine to tell us more.
All right, and Evan, I hear, is going out for tapas now while we all learn more about teaching with the Times. So, Evan, thank you for joining us. Have a glass of wine for us. We appreciate it. Okay, guys. Bye. Hasta luego. So remember I said it was going to be dizzying? It is going to be dizzying. We have divided this into 3 different categories that we hope make sense to you, but they are roughly ways to connect what you're teaching now with the past through the primary resource that is all the Times Archives, ways to connect with the present, which is our biggest category. Why does what you're teaching matter? Why is this piece of literature or this historical event still important today? What parallels are there? And 3, if we get to it, and we worry a little about time, how do we connect with multimedia? How do we use the growing New York Times videos, infographics, images to help students who might have a hard time with the difficult texts that are in the Times? How do they have a way in that way? So let's start with the first one. We're going backwards into history, and Evan just showed you Times Machine. So let's say you're teaching the Cold War. Of course, you would find this front page, which you probably, would even be able to guess the date of without looking at it, but from the day the Berlin Wall came down. And as Evan said, it's reported the day after. So this is November 10, 1989. East Germany opens frontier to the West. So you would, of course, find that, but on our site, it is our job to find those resources for you and put them into collections that you can use. So 25 years later, on the 25th anniversary of when the wall came down, the Times went wild. They had videos, they had slideshows, they had think pieces, they had interviews, they had all kinds of stuff. And we use that as an excuse to just collect a whole bunch of stuff all in one place for you to learn about, specifically about the Berlin Wall, but the bigger picture about the Cold War in general. We do several kinds of lesson plans on our site, but one that we'll talk about a lot on this webinar is something we call a text-to-text, which means sometimes there's just 2 texts that work together so well that we suggest that you put the 2 together, and then we ask a bunch of questions that puts them in conversation with each other. And we did that with this particular lesson plan, where we had an article that was from 1989, and then we had another one from 2014, 25 years later, and they both kind of focused on the human side of the breakdown of the Berlin Wall and the change, kind of the scars of the Cold War that were still there 25 years later and how it felt to families and individuals. There's also tons more in that particular lesson plan, as in every lesson plan we're going to show you, but I just wanted to introduce the idea. Michael is about to tell you about many more. Go ahead.
So the Times offers a rich breadth of primary source material. This lesson on Vietnam that you can see is a good example of that. It pulls on the paper's original reporting, like in the 1973 front page you see here, first-person accounts describing the war from different points of view, and photo collections. Actually, there are 3 slideshows featured in this lesson, including iconic images taken by war photographers, but also others, like the one you can see in the upper right-hand corner. This slideshow is pictures taken by American soldiers on tour. And it's useful to remember, as Evan was talking about, that the Times Archives go back as far as 1851. So in this Transcontinental Railroad lesson plan, we pulled a telegram sent by the New York City Chamber of Commerce, a sermon by an Episcopalian rector, and a speech made by the Sioux chief, Red Cloud, all from the Times Archives, and all offering different perspectives on the railroad's westward expansion in the 1800s. Any student of history knows that history often repeats itself. Evan talked about the rhymes or the echoes of history, and you can see these echoes of history every day in the paper. So in this lesson, we paired reporting on 2 factory tragedies, a century apart: the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City in 1911, and the Rana factory collapse in Bangladesh in 2013 that you may remember. And we let students make connections. We did the same kind of thing with matching Times reporting on Edward Snowden from 2013 and Daniel Ellsberg from 1971. Snowden leaked classified NSA files. Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers. Both leaks were condemned by the government. Both leaks revealed previously unknown activities by the government. This is the work that we do all the time at the Learning Network. But we also know that teachers naturally make these connections too. What echoes of history do you see in today's headlines? What connections are you already making in your own classrooms? Reach out to us. You can let us know in the chat box, or you can email us. We want to know. And further, what connections can students make? Stay tuned, and we'll tell you about a new student contest later on during this webinar. Evan talked about this. History in a textbook can feel often two-dimensional and flat. Even primary sources isolated from their original context can feel that way too. But an archival front page that can show the complex texture of a time period, that really can be gold in the classroom. And it can encourage students to be detectives, just like historians are. So in this lesson, we asked students to look at 3 whole front pages featuring reporting on the 1965 Selma to Montgomery marches and find out what can they learn about these marches, about the civil rights movement in general, and the time period from their analysis. Giving students the opportunity to dive into the Times archives gives them a sense of the real work that historians do, to piece together what happened in the past from an array of original documents. For example, the Times reported on the Armenian genocide extensively, though they obviously never used the word genocide at the time. In 1915, they published 145 articles alone, describing the atrocities as systematic and a campaign of race extermination. So in this lesson, we provide guidance to help students see what they can uncover by doing their own historical detective work. And students can do similar historical investigating with the Holocaust. We use a piece by the former executive editor of the Times, Max Frankel, as a guide for finding and analyzing Times reporting during the 30s and 40s. In 2001, it was the 150th anniversary of the Times, Mr. Frankel called the Holocaust reporting by the Times and other media, and I quote, the century's bitterest journalistic failure. Well, what do your students think? What can they find out by looking at the original reporting?
Okay, and English teachers, of course, you can use the Times archives as well. We put out a call to teachers via the weekly newsletter that we send and social media and ask everybody who got it to weigh in. How do you teach classic literature and events in history using Times archives? And we got a lot of answers, and many of them, Craig P., go English, he types in the chat box. I love it. We got lots and lots of answers, many of which we're going to include in this webinar, so I hope you'll see yours if you sent one in. But probably the most popular answer we got to the question of using the archives was about the Great Gatsby. Almost everybody understands that you kind of have to explain the milieu to kids. Like they have to know about flappers and flagpole sitters and prohibition and, just everything that was going on, jazz, et cetera. What made it the jazz age? What did that mean? What happened right before the stock market crashed? And so several teachers wrote into us to say they did that. And it was such a good idea that actually we had already published a lesson plan that did just that ourselves, which they didn't realize. But our very first idea in this collection for teaching the Gatsby with the Times is to do a gallery walk where you make the whole classroom into kind of a 1920s feel place with all kinds of artifacts, primary resources all over the room, many of which you can get from the Times. Another reader idea that we got is from a teacher named Krista Forrester, who wrote in and said that she's teaching the things they carried. And in the context of that, she's was talking about war poetry in general and going back to works from World War I, like Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. And she wrote in, today I showed students 3 Times articles, all from 1918, pertaining to mustard gas, so they could better grasp not only the image of gas, gas, quick boys, and ecstasy of fumbling from the poem, but also the intimation of the mustard gas's Swedish scent that's in the word dulce from the title, a detail I didn't fully comprehend until I read the Times article. Brett, unfortunately, is coming at the end of many of these, but Brett is our actual classroom teacher here, and he's going to give you an example next. Go ahead, Brett.
So I'm teaching the graphic novel Mouse for the first time. Of course, it's Art Spiegelman's memoir. And it was really interesting as I was researching how I wanted to approach this book to find and read the original New York Times book review of Mouse. The reviewer talks about the 4 unusual innovations he observed and then says, it's a comic book. Yes, a comic book, complete with word balloons, speed lines, exclamations, and dozens of techniques which I simply lack the terminology for. Now, this made me think about how Mouse is really a forerunner of so many more literary graphic novels that have followed, including the very popular March series that I can hardly keep in my classroom library right now. So reading this book review will help us to see it through the lens of someone who is seeing innovation in this genre, and maybe help us to think about how has this graphic novel genre changed over time. How is this book a forerunner for the graphic novels that they like to read and using it even as a memoir? And how do we see the book differently when we look at it after the fact than when we look at something when it's new? I think that question in itself will be really interesting to discuss as well.
Okay, are you overwhelmed yet? Because we're already moving on to number 2, connect with the present. And this is by far our most bulging category because there's just so many ways to do it. And anything we present to you today, you're going to think of 12 more ways you could do it yourself, and that's great. And tell us in the chat box. We'd love to hear. This is basically the question, why does this text or event still matter? What parallels are there with issues, events, or questions in our world today? So that's everything from, we have a whole lesson plan on teaching Frankenstein with the New York Times that looks at, among other things, contemporary ethics questions in bioethics. But it's also things like, if you're teaching S.A. Hinton, who are outsiders today? We're getting ready for your second poll, and you're going to do something we ask kids to do. This is a handout, which is, again, in the resources list, that we have tried with kids, which is literature quote bingo. We kind of are bingo fanatics on our site. I guess I'm proud to say, I don't know. Anyway, this is 9 famous quotes from literature, and what we ask kids to do is just on their own, try to put those quotes toward any actual event from the present or past that they apply to just start thinking about the meaning of literature in the real world. But extra credit, can you apply it to the times? So you're going to do a very short version of that right now in our poll. What we're going to ask you to do is decide which of the 3 quotes below applies best to the news right now. So which of these 3 quotes? Is it Big Brother is watching you from George Orwell, 1984? Is it was the best of times, it was the worst of times from Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens? Or is it people generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for, which is from Harper Lee? Which of the 3 would you vote for as would apply best to the front page today? And go ahead and vote. And once you have your answer, you might tell us why in the chat box. Again, you have to click in to make this count. I know, Annalisa says it's a very difficult choice. On purpose, Annalisa. I'm interested to what the answer would be. Okay, ready? I'm going to reveal. Has everybody clicked? Okay, wait. Oh, it's the Harper Lee, and I just threw that in. That's not actually on the bingo, but of course you could customize that bingo with the books you're reading. Fascinating. Does anybody, are you reading the chat box? Does anybody want to say why they picked the Harper Lee really quick? Because fake news is everywhere, Margarita says. People are retreating to their bubbles more than ever. All right, and we just had a giant election yesterday that might even show that more. So thank you, everybody. Okay, that handout that I just gave you comes from a collection we have called 50 Reusable Activity Sheets to Teach Any Day's Times. We're not big worksheet fans, but sometimes it's just an easy way to make something that to kind of show kids that the Times any day has a lot to teach you. Another piece that comes from that collection that's very applicable to the topic today is just one that we call Connecting the Times to Your World, and it explicitly asks kids to do that thing that a lot of English teachers already naturally do, where you ask them to make a connection between the text to self, connections between you and the text, text to text, text to another text, and text to the world. And this worksheet asks you to do it with Times articles. We're about to show you a lot of examples. Some come from the Learning Network, some come from teachers, and some, like this one, come from both. We, again, put this call out to teachers. How do you teach with the Times for literature and history? And we got a lot of answers. Right away on Twitter, we heard from Patricia, and she said that she does Socratic seminars with Martin Luther King's Dream Speech, paired with Michiko Kakutani's The Lasting Power of Dr. King's Dream Speech, and that synergy for her 8th graders. This is a piece that was written on the 50th anniversary of I Have a Dream, and it's a beautiful piece. And actually, it was so good, we had already made a lesson plan on it. So I don't think she knew that, but there it is. Michael's got a lot more examples.
So let's talk about the Constitution. We want students to think deeply, even question their long-held assumptions. And so, for example, for students studying the Constitution today, Professor Louis Michael Seidman's op-ed Proposing that we give up on the Constitution can make for thought-provoking debate. It can force students to think about the role that this almost 230-year-old document should play as we address the most pressing issues of our day. Sam Apple's satirical op-ed on the Bill of Rights, entitled "The Bill of Rights We Deserve," begins with a revised First Amendment, and I quote, "A well-stocked fridge being necessary to the stuffing of the face, the right of the people to consume alarmingly large sandwiches washed down by more than 16 fluid ounces of soda shall not be infringed, nor shall any person have to answer for the number of sticky buns consumed in a single sitting, except in a time of public danger, such as a congressionally declared sticky bun shortage." Now, humor can be a powerful tool for learning. Using this op-ed, we ask students to consider what social commentary is Mr. Apple making about our society, and then we encourage students to make their own satirical Bill of Rights to prove whatever point they want to make. While the archives only go back to 1851, the Times has plenty to say about older history too. For example, this lesson helps to bring Machiavelli alive for students and to bring his 16th century treatise to the 21st century. We often try to help teachers take what students are already talking about in their own lives, such as athletes kneeling during the national anthem, and turn these topics into opportunities for learning. So in this lesson, we pair an op-ed by David Brooks arguing that student athletes should stand for the national anthem with an 1852 speech by Frederick Douglass asserting that July 4th does not mean the same thing for slaves as it does for free people. Paired together, these texts help begin a conversation for students, one that explores the purposes of patriotism and the meaning of democracy to all citizens. And a related conversation can come up regarding how we view our shared history. In fact, our nation is still fighting over how the Reconstruction period is remembered. Eric Foner, the American historian, writes in the Times, "Reconstruction has long been misrepresented or simply neglected in our schools. And unlike Confederate generals and founders of the Ku Klux Klan, few, if any, monuments exist to the black and white leaders of that era." W.E.B. Du Bois, in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, called the dominant historical thinking about Reconstruction during his lifetime, quote, propaganda. We want students to use these texts to think about how can history be used as propaganda? How can history be political? Why does how we remember Reconstruction still matter today? Indeed, the United States is certainly not the only country fighting about how history should be remembered. This lesson you can see here explores, should the Russian Revolution be remembered as one of history's greatest turning points, or should it be relegated to the dustbin of history? Students can read a Times article noting that the Kremlin plans to sit out the 100th anniversary of the revolution this year. So we ask students to think about, what purpose does history serve the Russian government right now? And we show students how some Russians are trying to bring the momentous events of the revolution to life using Facebook, no less. Common themes in history, from nationalism to industrialization and human rights, come up every single day in the Times. Our lesson on the Myanmar Crisis doesn't just help students learn about the Rohingya people and their persecution through articles, videos, photography, even podcasts, but it also helps students see the roots of ethnic hatred across the world and through history. We used Amanda Taub's essay in the Interpreter column as a way to investigate this common theme in history. And using Daniel Victor's analysis piece comparing Jewish refugees of the 30s with Syrian refugees today, we asked students to make connections through history, from the Syrian refugee crisis now to the Jewish refugee crisis of the 1930s. What are similarities? What are differences? And what can we learn from the past, and how can we make better choices today?
Okay, English teachers, I got your back. You thought you may not have examples, but I've got lots of examples. First of all, there are many things happening in the news that just beg to be taught alongside of classics. For one prime example, this summer, Julius Caesar, if you're aware of the big brouhaha about the Central Park production that was called Unmistakably Trumpian, and there were all kinds of pieces in the New York Times and elsewhere about it. A teacher named Karen Gold wrote to us to say that she used that and that it led to a great discussion in her class on the role of art. And her students had a line that I just love. I think any teacher would love it. The kid said to her, "How did Shakespeare know?" So that's, I guess, what you're trying to get out of kids, that they find it so relevant that they can't believe that the writer somehow saw into the future. More examples, right now, if you are teaching Speak, The Scarlet Letter, Handmaid's Tale, and so many more, you are just tripping over content. So much so that actually the Times has just created a new gender desk where there's a whole team of people reporting on gender led by this woman, Jessica Bennett, who wrote the piece that's up at the top here, The Click Moment, How the Weinstein Scandal Unleashed a Tsunami. And she traces it from Anita Hill on, and it's fascinating. We have collections on Speak and Scarlet Letter, but they clearly need to be updated every day these days. Another obvious example, last spring when 1984 was flying off the shelves, the Times wrote tons and tons about why and how it relates to today, et cetera. That was a great opportunity for us to have a whole teaching collection. Now, in that collection, you'll find all kinds of stuff. We go back and find, early book reviews, the obit of George Orwell, et cetera, as well as reporting from 1984 itself, looking at, when that year came around, how relevant is this book. But what we really focused on, this is familiar to teachers, is essential questions. So we asked, what constitutes an abuse of power? What's more important, privacy or national security? Those kinds of questions. What are the dangers of government-controlled media? Things that you can always apply, but you can certainly apply now. But we try to have a little fun on the site too, and it's not all grim all the time. So, for example, this is a very popular text-to-text that we once did with Catcher in the Rye and a piece that was in the Sunday Review called The Case for Delayed Adulthood, that was about how different the notions of adulthood and teenagehood are now today. They're starting to bleed, and kids can compare 1951 with Catcher to today. Of course, there are a lot of millennial and Gen Z things they could debate in the lesson. We also sometimes work backwards from what we know students are interested in. So in this text-to-text, for instance, we went with fashion first and moved backwards to literature with the street style, specifically Supreme, which is this really trendy street style that some kids are really into. And we use it with the Maupassant short story, The Necklace, which is on in basically every anthology, just to talk about material culture and labels and, that sort of thing. This one should not have worked, but it worked great, I think. As a longtime writer for us, Amanda Christy Brown paired John Milton's 1670-something When I Consider How My Light Is Spent, a sonnet, with an op-ed by Frank Bruni called Today's Exhausted Super Kids, which is all about kids trying to get into competitive colleges and standardized testing and that whole thing. But it just breaks wide open because she asks, how is our light spent? How should our light be spent? What is the meaning of how we spend our time in our life? And it's a great one. Okay, here's some examples that came in from teachers, and I want to apologize now if I don't get to yours because we got so many. But here's some of them. Jason Salinas told us that whenever he starts teaching with the Times, he just puts the name of the work or the author into the search box and sees what we've got. And so for Emily Dickinson, he found this cool article about how Emily Dickinson is being rethought, who she is and what she means to literature. And the article begins with, in the Trumpian sense of the term, she's the ultimate nasty woman. So you might want to look into that if you've got Emily Dickinson on your curriculum. Another one he suggested is yet a third example of a time when a teacher suggested something that I don't think he knew we already did, which was if you're teaching Huck Finn, you know that the N-word is in that book 240 some odd times, and you have to figure out how to deal with it in class. So this lesson pairs that with the Ta-Nehisi Coates essay from the Times, In Defense of a Loaded Word, and to really get kids thinking and talking about issues around that. This is the most, I want to go ahead and say, I've had this job 11 years now. I think this is the most moving reader idea we've ever gotten. A woman, and I think she might even be on this webinar, so shout out if you are, Margaret. She works with young people in detention in Washington State, and she wrote to us, and it's now a reader idea on our site, about how she used the Langston Hughes poem, Mother to Son. Many of you know it. It has the line, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. And she read it out loud, and one young man was so moved by it, he just started sobbing. Well, a week later, she's working with 10 young men, they go back to their cells at the end of the book group. A week later, it just so happened that the op-ed columnist Charles Blow wrote a piece called Defining Moments and Crystal Stairs that was actually all about what that poem means to him and what it could mean to other young Black men. And this was in 2013, so it was right after Trayvon Martin and, of course, at the beginning of many more incidents like that. And he says, that poem helped change my life when I was younger. It steadied me when the world was rocky. Maybe today it can do something it can do the same for someone else. And Margaret writes about how every kid wanted a copy of that op-ed and took it back to read on their own. Last example is just so stealable that it's going to be on our site any day now. Michelle Oppenheimer, another teacher, wrote to us to say she talks about the American dream in the classroom, and she does it by finding all the ways the Times has characterized the American dream over the last almost century now. 1933, 1951, 59, 65, 96, and now this recent one, 2017. How has it changed? Is it a real thing? I am looking at the clock while I'm talking and slightly panicking because we have no time, but we're going to go now to Brett to give you some other great examples.
So in this text-to-text piece for The Outsiders, which is a book I taught for 10 years with 8th graders, it's a book that still speaks to kids, but in this piece we look at how gang violence is similar to and different from the gang violence described in The Outsiders. So it pulls from a New York Times piece that interviewed real gang members in Chicago today. And this shows, again, linking the past to the present. But in the course of writing this piece, one of the best discoveries I found was the S.E. Hinton essay published in 1967, in which she really shows she was cognizant of what she was doing with this book, starting a whole new genre. I always tell the kids that when we talk about The Outsiders, but hearing her as a teenager express what was needed as a change in the literature available for young people was really moving, and I recommend using that essay when you're talking about the book. I think it also begs a question from today's teenagers: where is there room for growth in today's YA? What's sort of the next jump that the genre should take? Another book that I teach is The Book Thief, now that I teach 9th grade. And we look at the original book review for the New York Times of this. John Green was the author of the book review, so kids get excited to know that he's not just an author of his own books, but he reviews others. I invite them to renovate the book review, and what I mean by that is go inside of the book review, find what you agree with and what you disagree with in terms of John Green's assessment of the book. And then you can cross out what you want, you can alter what you want in this book review, and start making it into your own. You want to add your own ideas as well. I think most of us as English teachers are familiar with working with mentor text at this point, and this is kind of a twist on that idea. Instead of taking a look at several book reviews first before writing their own on a blank screen or a blank page, this kind of takes away some of that intimidation factor of the blank screen and says, here's a book review, look at the structure, but also think about what you agree or disagree with and make it your own. And that renovation process encourages them to look at both the structure and their own evaluation of the text, which I like that it accomplishes more than one goal at a time. The next logical step with that is to go into copy change. What you see here is a piece from a reader's idea that I published on New York Times Learning. It's a sample of how a student took an article about a wildfire and then rewrote the first paragraph so that it's about the fire at the beginning of The Lord of the Flies. Now, what's interesting about this is you can take a New York Times article, put it on a Google document, and split it into parts. Then assign kids in pairs to rewrite those parts of the article line by line, mimicking the grammatical structures of the original, but making it about the literature that you're studying. So, for instance, instead of quoting an expert firefighter, as they might in this article, what would Piggy or Ralph say about the loss of control in the beginning of the book that, of course, foreshadows the fiery end of Lord of the Flies? So that's another example of how we can work on writing skills, sounding like a professional journalist, at the same time as we're working on looking how the plot and themes of the original literature connect to the news articles of today.
Okay. Guys, I have to say we've been great at timing up until this webinar, but it's just packed full. So we are going to end up skipping quite a few. I just wanted to tell you this last one through Multimedia, you can click through yourself and see a lot of things we would have told you, and the links are all there. I want to give time for Brett to keep talking. The only thing I want to say is that you should if you want to search the Times to find your own multimedia, every single author you teach has what's known as a Times Topics page. And if you put in Jane Austen, you're going to find crazy things like a whole infographic that it looks at Jane Austen's word choices and why she still endures. But I'm going to skip ahead many to let Brett talk to you about how he uses images. And then I think we only have time to go on to questions. But you can access this on your own and look at the materials yourself. So, Brett, go ahead.
So in Teaching to Kill a Mockingbird, when we arrive at the scene where the lynch mob comes for Tom Robinson, a lot of students don't make the connection that they're actually reading about a lynch mob. They've learned about that in history class, but when I use the actual terminology, they realize, oh, that's what's going on here in this scene. Then I share this image with them, which I found on the New York Times Learning Network's page on To Kill a Mockingbird, on teaching the book. And it really, you just sense the kids get the gravity of what we're reading. We're looking at one scene, a fictional scene, that represents something that was going on, that was pervasive. It was not an anomaly in the South. So I think that really is an eye-opening image to share with them when you're studying that part of To Kill a Mockingbird. Another assignment that I worked on with To Kill a Mockingbird just this week was inviting kids to choose their own articles of interest from the headlines and then write about them in the voice of one of the characters. So what would Atticus say about gun violence was what one student chose, or what would Miss Maudie Atkinson say about the recovery efforts in Puerto Rico? And they had to use a piece from the text To Kill a Mockingbird to justify their voice as well as they responded to the news. And I know in a lot of schools, and ours included, book clubs and independent reading is becoming a vital force in the English classroom. So sometimes finding an image that's shared on New York Times Learning, I think this one is from the picture prompts, can be really useful in getting kids to talk about the book they're reading. So I might have 30 kids reading 30 different books in the classroom, but they could all find some link to this picture. What does this picture have to say about the book you're reading right now, or the book that your Lit Circle or book club is reading at the moment? This picture makes us wonder, is the person standing apart because they choose to, because they're being excluded? What's happening here? And it's really cool to see how they can take an open-ended picture like this and relate it to a plethora of different texts around the classroom.
Thanks, Brett. So super quickly, we have lesson plans using maps for United States history. We have lesson plans using maps and graphs for global history. We have a weekly Country of the Week geography and history quiz. The New York Times has Retro Report videos, which it's a whole dozens and dozens of videos that cover different topics in history that kind of echo through history.
Okay, Michael's writing me notes. I'll take 20 seconds because we really like to leave 10 minutes for questions. This is our last slide, and then we will take questions. Just so you know, coming up December 6th through January 12th, we're going to invite students to do what we just talked to you about doing, which is making connections between whatever they're reading and the New York Times. And of course, as we always do, we'll publish a whole lesson plan that you can help them do that with. We'll probably make some more bingo games, for God's sake. And we hope you'll invite your students to join in. We have a contest calendar on our site, and we're always running contests constantly. So I think we are going to go to questions, and I'm very sorry that I skipped a few slides, but not so many. If you have questions, Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, we do have some very specific questions. Here's one from Ryan from the company Better or School Better. Any advice on using the Times resources for local stories and historical events?
I wish this was live because I don't know what he means by local. Maybe he means New York City?
Or maybe local to where he is.
I mean, all I can tell you is Time Search is your friend, right? You don't know what you're going to unearth. And in fact, the slide I went too fast through shows how you can kind of go to the Time Search and then you can further eliminate or further sharpen your search by picking years, by choosing multimedia only, by picking things like that. So I would say put in whatever your local area is into Time Search, and who knows what you'll come up with. If you have access to Times Machine, I'll tell you, I once spent maybe 5 hours looking at events that happened on my street in Brooklyn just for fun, going back to the 1800s. I mean, you can get very, very local. Well, the Times was a very local newspaper then.
But I also want to just say that, of course, we're here talking about how to use the Times in your classroom, but please, teachers, use your local newspapers. And many newspapers are online, whether you're from a small town or a big city, and they're a great resource, too, to use in the classroom, especially to cover local events.
Even inviting kids to find a global story that connects to that local one. If you're talking about something locally, find something in the Times that connects or looks at the issue on a global scale.
Okay, another question. This is from Jane from JBH Tutoring. Do you have anything on Things Fall Apart?
We don't, but that's a great ad. If you look at the bottom of your resources list, you'll see every work of literature that we have anything about at all. Unfortunately, it's not as complete as we'd like it to be, but we're always growing these things. Like we're going to put one about Jane Austen soon, for instance. So thank you, and we'll put that on the list.
That's helpful. And I saw in the chat box people talked about, do we have anything for Persepolis? That's been on our list. So if you have titles to suggest that you want to see us create lessons for, please, you can let us know in the chat box. You can send us an email. We're always creating new lessons every week.
Here's another question from Craig from Glastonbury High School. Do you have any lesson plans on writer's craft or pieces by your writers discussing their process?
Pieces on writer's craft, so many. Wow, that's almost a whole other webinar. I will tell you just very quickly that we have two big pieces. One is about argumentative writing and writing op-eds and that kind of thing. We did a whole webinar on it, and there's a lesson plan that captures it. But there's a whole other lesson plan, and we may do a webinar in the spring on personal writing. And all of those, like every lesson plan we do, captures every single thing the Times does that's relevant to that type of writing. Or that subject. So those are two places to start. But you should also know that every single day we ask 2 writing prompts on our site. And we get kids from all over the world writing in, thousands of them, to answer, and they can see each other's answers.
And let me put a plug in just for some of our contests. Right now, we're actually running a review contest. So students are writing book reviews, architecture reviews, restaurant reviews, reviews on any type of artistic category that the Times covers. That's running, I think, until November 17th, although you have to check on our site to see exactly the end date. We also have an editorial contest where we get thousands and thousands of submissions from students. That runs in the fall, so students get to
in
the spring, to test out their argumentative writing. So that's another opportunity for student writing.
All right. We have another question here from Annalisa. Are you planning specific lessons for 25th November, International Day on Violence Against Women?
I'm sorry, are we planning
any specific lessons for
violence against women? I have to say we have in the past tried to hit those days, when they're important days that we feel like should be celebrated. We've created content for them, and we kind of have gotten away from it. And frankly, that's because the news cycle is so fast these days that it's hard to take a day and say we're going to definitely do something because you just don't know what's going to come up. So no, we haven't done anything, but that doesn't mean we don't have lots and lots of resources that are not applicable. We have a huge piece that we put up in March, Women's History Month, that's about teaching women's history with the Times. And you can search that on our site and it should come up.
And we have, I'm just coming to mind, the Speak text-to-text.
It's about rape culture.
Yeah.
Although, it's a little old given the speed of the news cycle right now, what's happening. But there's certainly a lot too. And I put this invitation out to anyone listening. Half of our content these days is reader ideas. It's ideas from people like Brett, who started out by sending us reader ideas, and then now he just writes for us regularly because he has so many ideas that he could basically be another employee of the site. So if you would like to write to us, just write to our email and tell us how you teach with the Times and what you'd like to do with it, and we will, get back to you.
I have one last question, and I think this applies to everyone. And this is from John Riddle from Fairmont Community, is there an archive of lesson plans? Just so everyone's aware.
My Lord, yes. Going back to 1998. Am I going to lie right now and pretend like it's easy to search? No, I am not. But I will tell you that if you go to the Learning Network and you scroll down to the search bar, which is underneath all the pretty pictures, and you put in Hamlet or whatever it is that you're looking for, things will come up.
But I just want to caution you that a lot of people can get confused because there's a search bar at the top of the Times, and that'll have you search in the entire New York Times, and you can get lost in those 13 million articles that Evan was talking about. So make sure you scroll down to below the fold of our site on the Learning Network, and you'll see another search bar. It's actually underneath an ad, and there you can type in whatever topics you're looking for, and that's where our lesson plans, our student activities will come up that are related to that topic.
People are saying you could do 2 webinars. This could go an hour and a half, et cetera. And thank you for that. It's true. And maybe we tried to cram too much in, which is our constant problem. But thank you guys for being with us. I think we have to stop now. But we love this. We love doing it, and we'd love to hear from you. So please write to us or tweet us or Facebook us or whatever.
And one last thing before we go, just anybody can watch this on demand. So if you have colleagues or friends who you think would be interested in this, please have them register, sign up, and then they can watch this on demand.
All right.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.